Welcome back to the Noble Pursuit podcast. I'm your host, Landry Coleman. Today's guest is Roland Warren. Roland is the CEO and president of CareNet. He's also a leading voice on fatherhood, family, and the pro-life movement. For years, Roland has challenged men to embrace their God-given roles as husbands, fathers, and leaders. In this episode, we talk about the importance of fatherhood, the impact of father wounds, and how to find healing, and the future of the pro-life movement. Here's my conversation with Roland Warren. All right, Roland, thank you so much for joining the Noble Pursuit podcast today. I was telling you a little bit beforehand that I like to get my guests to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their stories. I think it's more powerful to hear from you than to hear it from me. So if you could just tell the audience a little bit about yourself and who you are.
Okay. Yep. Good to be with you, Landry. Thanks so much for having me on your podcast. I am Roland Warren. I'm president and CEO of a ministry called CareNet, which is an organization that was started, 50 years ago, and was really focused on helping women and men facing pregnancy decisions choose life for their unborn children and abundant life for their families. And so I've been president and CEO here for almost 13 years in October. Before that, I was president of an organization called National Fatherhood Initiative for about 12 years, and then from the corporate world before then. Married, I have been married for 44 years now. I've got two sons who are older, and I'm a grandfather to five. So this issue of helping men be better dads and be better men is near and dear to my heart, just based on my background in terms of what I've done from a nonprofit and ministry perspective, and certainly as I kind of lead CareNet, that's a core part of our objective, is to really help not just the woman who's facing the pregnancy decision, but also the guy who's facing the pregnancy decision. So we don't talk about them as in that context of like this is a separate issue. It's fathers and mothers who are making life decisions. Life begins at conception. That means, when you're faced with the abortion decision, it's not like I don't want to be a mother. You already are a mother. It's just a question of which kind you're going to be. And the same with the father. I don't want to be a father. No, it's not that. That train's already passed. But it's what kind of father will you be to the child growing inside her, and then once the child is out. So so it's a big issue for us, and integrating that piece into the ministry has been a core passion that we've had here.
So what made you want to get involved in the pro-life ministry?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I kind of got involved inadvertently, at least from my perspective, but I got my girlfriend pregnant when I was in college. Now my wife of 44 years. And we're both undergrads at Princeton. She went to student health services, got the pregnancy test. The nurse comes out and says, test is positive. I assume the news is negative. So, of course, you're going to have an abortion. My wife, Yvette, says, no, I don't want to have an abortion. I want to get married. I want to have my baby. The nurse is like, well, how are you going to graduate from Princeton with a baby? Doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense. What do you want to do when you graduate? It says, I want to become a doctor. The nurse is like, gosh, become a doctor with a baby. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Anyway, but, she persisted there. But, Yvette came back. I assumed to the dorm room, and we talked about it. And we said, we're going to move forward to plan. We're going to get married. And that's what we did. So I was 20. She was 19. And we got married. She did graduate from Princeton with not one baby, but two. She went on to become a doctor and has been practicing, 30 years now, I think, close to 30 years. And we have both of our boys. And so it's been kind of amazing. So, so there was a sort of an intersection of the life issue and the fatherhood issue, both sort of coming together with the pregnancy decision. So that's why this work, is not something that's foreign to me, or even the work I was doing in National Fatherhood Initiative, not foreign to me in the context of becoming a father fairly early in life. Growing up without my dad as well, which I know a lot of guys still face today. And so it's just become a passion for me to kind of help men be better dads. But in this particular context around the life issue, it's really critical. Life decisions need life support. And the father of the baby is the most critical support. He's the most influential in her decision to abort. And so we want to do everything we can to help him kind of step into that role to support her and the child growing inside her. And a lot of part of our work also is about also trying to encourage marriage, because that's the best societal glue to connect the father to his child and the mother of his child heart to heart.
So when you look back when you found out that you were gonna be a dad, do you remember what you were feeling and what you were thinking?
It was probably shock. I mean, I wasn't confused on how that happened. There's a certain process, something you kind of do,
Right.
that kind of facilitates that. But it's like most things. I mean, not most things, but like many things. I mean, one of the lessons I learned in life that I don't that I try to remember as much as possible is that actions have consequences. That doesn't sound very profound, but although actions have consequences, you have no control over the consequences of your actions. And that's really a key lesson that so many don't learn. And yeah, you got 100% control of your actions, but 0% control of the consequences of your actions. And the act that you take to deal with the consequences of your actions is another act, which then has another set of consequences. So, for me, in terms of the life decision, and people who make the abortion decision, they think, okay, this happened. All right, there's an action that happened. Okay, now we're going to do this to get rid of that, and kind of put a kind of period on that. But that's not actually what happens. It's another action that leads to another range of other consequences, all of which you have no control over. So, I think, in my sort of 20-year-old mind, I think I had some sense of that. We were Christians, and obviously we shouldn't have been having sex outside of wedlock, but we did, and we didn't want to complicate one sort of sin or bad decision with the second one, and so that's kind of where we were. But in that moment, I don't know. I just I was probably just sort of stunned
Yeah.
and wasn't certain, but God is faithful, and He walked us through that, and that's why I try to encourage guys facing those pregnancy decisions to do. Like, God is faithful. You know, um, the sex was the sin, not the baby. Children are a blessing from the Lord, and so when you view it that way, then it so changes your perspective. And I think we quickly were able to do that. And we just watched God do what He do. He just opened doors and made things happen in that context to help us start as a young family, and kind of here we are today.
So you mentioned growing up with a single mother. What impact do you think that that had on your life, but also on how you father your kids?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's I actually wrote a book about that called "Raising Sons of Promise: A Guide for Single Mothers of Boys." It really kind of walks through that experience that I had with my mom, and yeah, it's a foundational um, experience for any kid growing up without a dad. I'm fond of saying that kids have a hole in their soul in the shape of their dad. And if a father is unwilling or unable to fill that hole, it can leave a wound that's not easily healed. And so, for a lot of years, I'm sort of a wounded soul, and to some degree still am. There's that absence there of not having that relationship that can really shape how you view things. And from my perspective, if I kind of psychoanalyze myself a little bit, I probably used that as a way, just around achievement in order to get my father's attention, if you will, that kind of thing, to be sort of worthy of his love. But lots of guys that go the opposite direction. So many guys are incarcerated, grew up without involved, responsible, and committed fathers in their lives, and they went the other path. you know, so yeah, it shapes how you view lots of things. I think the other thing is it shapes how you view sort of family dynamics and how you view the family. It's not God's design for the family. That's not God's design. God's design is a father and mother united in marriage, loving each other, loving their child, and then loving God. That's His design for the family. And so when you kind of intentionally walk in this direction, you're missing some things that God has designed. And so it becomes harder to break that cycle because it's difficult to be what you don't see. So if you're a kid growing up without a dad, it can be very easy when you have that kind of opportunity to quote, become one, to say, well, she can do it on her own. So I don't need to be in there because, otherwise you have to kind of deal with the absence and the pain of that. So what's modeled for you is a father absent home. And that's what we see. Father absent homes and kids who grew up in them, mothers, women and men who grew up in those settings are more likely to create father absent homes, which then create father absent homes. So I think that was a key part of it. But I guess the last thing I would say, though, but there was definitely a longing for me to have that, to have a father who was in my life that way. And funny, I took all the time. I learned a lot from television back then. It was kind of a different era when I was growing up, but the shows like Good Times or the Brady Bunch or whatever, I was kind of drawn to that family structure. So it cast a vision in my mind. And then also, being a part of my church, I saw men being husbands and fathers, and it was aspirational for me. So, by the grace of God, when I got Yvette pregnant, the notion of being sort of a baby daddy that brings diapers or something like that, it was it wasn't something that resonated with me because the vision had been cast for me in a lot of different ways of God's design for family, and then that enabled us to sort of break the cycle. But yeah, but so many don't. And again, that woundedness that comes from this rejection from someone who's supposed to love you like no other can be a difficult thing to deal with. And I know a lot of guys who struggle with that, and on occasions, I struggle with it even still today, even with all that God's done in that area.
Yeah, so for
Yeah.
guys that are still struggling with it, and they're trying to figure out how to heal this wound that they have in their heart, where should they start?
Well, I mean, from a biblical standpoint, I mean, one of the comforts in Scripture is that God is the father to the fatherless. And I think that, going to God and kind of being very transparent about, that woundedness and that hole there, I think is an essential thing to do. A lot of times guys will try to fill that with other things, sex or drugs or, alcohol, whatever, or relationships or all kinds of things. When the reality is you have this deep sense of rejection that's been shaping a lot of how you've been reacting in the world. And I think taking that and putting it at the feet of the cross and letting God work through and heal that is critically important. And so that piece is part of it because your history is linked to your destiny. I think the other thing, which is really critical, is that this starts to affect how you father. To some degree, in terms of your view of fatherhood, and might need to rework some stuff. In other words, finding men that in your life or in your circle of influence that are good fathers or had a different experience, and being able to sort of like the Tour de France, you kind of draft behind those guys so that you can maybe unlearn some things that you didn't that you unlearn some things, and maybe that have been practices that you've had connected to your fathering. So that's one of the things that we do with a lot of the resources at CareNet. There's lots of resources out there. Like when I was at National Fatherhood Initiative, there's a course called 24/7 Dad. That is great at helping guys walk through that. And a big part of that is like exploring your fathering history and really kind of coming to terms with the kind of father that you had, and the impact that that's going to have on the kind of father you're going to be. But I think God kind of steps into those moments. Um, I'd say the last thing though is particularly for guys who are married. My wife was tremendously helpful to me. Kind of walking through and working through some of those issues. By God's grace, she grew up with a great dad, and so she had that expectation of me and that desire for me. And so when there were sort of moments when maybe, I was kind of struggling a bit in terms of kind of processing some of this stuff, she was super helpful and super encouraging. And I'll give just a quick example. When my older son was about, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 or so, I told my wife, I said, this whole hugging and kissing thing seems like a weird thing to me as he gets older. I just doesn't seem like I don't know, it just didn't feel right. My wife was like, "Well, you just, you got to do it. He needs that from you." And years later, I read the fatherhood research about physical touch and how kids desperately need that from their fathers and their mothers. And like God's grace, and I said, "Well, I'm just going to lean in and do it." So I just kind of did it, you know. And now I hug and kiss my boys, and they're in their 40s now, and the same thing. Now, when I process that and think about that, like again, so I don't analyze myself or just kind of like, where does that come from? Well, when I was a little boy, that didn't happen for me, right? I didn't have that kind of experience. So I was about to pass on to the next generation something from my experience, right? That was damaging.
Yeah.
But by the grace of God, I had a wife who had that perspective, and frankly, I had to have the humility to listen and to lean on that insight that she had in that moment, and then walk through that, and then there's the blessing. And now both of my sons very loving to their kids, and physical touch is a very important part of the parenting process, and they do that with their kids, and I watch them observe that, and it just brings me a lot of joy. So if you're prayerful about it, God will, again, set that woundedness at the feet of the cross and say, Lord, help me deal with this woundedness. And then he'll bring people into your life if you're open and humble to kind of help you walk through things, right? Fatherhood is key to God. Like we know that. Like in scripture, I think it's Matthew chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. where you have the baptism of Jesus, right? And and what happens? Well, comes out of the water, the dove comes out and says, "What? This is my son whom I love. I'm well pleased." Now that was before Jesus had done anything. He had done anything in ministry. And what you see in that moment is affirmation before temptation, right? Because then in chapter 4, he's tempted by the devil. Well, what do you see there? That's God the Father affirming him in his humanity, you know, so that Jesus knew whose he was and knew who he was. Now, if you didn't get that affirmation from your earthly father, it is something that God wants you to have, right? And he gives it to us from a spiritual standpoint. But frankly, I know there's some ministries and programs where guys actually do that. They get that affirmation from another guy who's within the circle of influence or an older man to kind of help move that wound. But there's just lots of things like that you can do to be intentional about, hey, I've got a father wound. I don't want to live out of my woundedness, right? I want that to be healed and then build from that in terms of my roles as a father and a husband and a man in society.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I personally struggled with was seeing God as a good father. You hear about that all the time, like growing up in church, but you're like, well, here is what my earthly father looked like. I can't comprehend what a good heavenly father looks like. Did you feel anything similar to that?
Yeah, I don't know that I processed it quite that way at that time. I mean, looking back on it, but look, having bad fathers in the world is Satan's plan. I mean, don't get it twisted. Look. Yeah, I have an example. I wrote this book called Bad Dads of the Bible: 8 Mistakes Every Good Dad Can Avoid, and you can get it on Amazon or anyplace else. But it's a great book for for folks to read. Like there are only 8 mistakes, and you don't mess up those 8 things. You're good. I checked. There's not 9 or 10. It's just 8. So but I looked at characters in the Bible through the lens of fatherhood: Abraham, David, folks like that. Anyway, and the mistakes that they made in their fathering realm. Well, one of the points I make in the book is that, this fathering is very much tied to the gospel. It's tied to the promotion of the gospel, right? So the illustration I use with people often is that if you wanted to make a cross and you had 2 pieces of wood and you laid them together, right, and they're on the ground, how many nails would you need to put in the kind of that cross section in order to hold the cross together when it stands up? It's 2, not 1. If you put 1 in there, when you stand up, it'll just rotate. 2. And I think about that in the context of like the 10 Commandments, right? The first 4 commandments are about our relationship with God, right? The last 5 commandments, I've got my numbers right. The last 5 commandments are about our relationship with man, which is sort of like the cross beam. So you got the upper part and then you got the cross part. And then you have that center that connects those 2 together, which is the 5th commandment, which is to honor your father and your mother, right?
Yeah.
So fatherhood is part of that context because it's easier to honor someone who's honorable, right? Mothers carry children in the womb for 9 months. I mean, mothers are very connected to their children. It's very difficult for mothers to leave their children. In fact, we don't have a mother absence problem anywhere, except frankly, as it pertains to the abortion issue. But in the broader culture, there's not like, oh, we have a motherhood issue. Like it doesn't exist because that physically, biologically, socially, all those different things, that first nail, right, is nailed in. But that second nail, honor your father, like that fatherhood nail, that's one that's in the hand of the culture. And we used to kind of nail that one in more, like say we need that one. But now we kind of say, well, do we really need this nail or not? Throw it aside, right? And that's why often you'll see, or at times you'll see, that a young child, when they're young, like when that cross is on the ground, oh, they're followers of Christ. But then when they have to stand up on their own, whoop, it's gone. Why? Because the notion of having a loving heavenly father can be an anathema to someone who had an unloving earthly father. See, a earthly father is supposed to be a reflection of a heavenly reality. It's dimmer, but it's supposed to be a reflection of a heavenly reality. That's why when Jesus was talking to a group of people, and I imagine a lot of fathers, and he said, he says that, if your child asks you, for bread, would you give him a stone? If you ask him for a fish, would you give him a snake? And then he goes on to say, how much more, right? Though you're evil. Like, so these are earthly guys, right? Though you're evil, that you know how to give your children good things. Well, that whole illustration falls apart if the presumption wasn't that earthly fathers were good. even ones that aren't following Christ. So fatherhood is it's a it's not a saving grace, it's a common grace, right? Like we have grace, the rain that falls on the wicked and the just, right? Good fatherhood is it's a common grace that God has given to society in the design of the family. So yeah, it what you said to me is not surprising because that's the enemy's plan. And that's why the attack on the family is the attack on fatherhood. That's the attack.
Yeah.
That's the attack because that's Satan's plan. Because if I can take the fathers out of the home, then the notion of calling a heavenly father a good father, right? So
Right.
if you're not a kid that's ever heard like Jesus did in his humanity, this is my father, this is my son rather, whom I love. Like you've never been affirmed in terms of who you are or whose you are, and now you're facing the temptations of the world. I mean, exactly where Satan wants you. So before Jesus walked out there to face those three temptations, he knew who he was and he knew whose he was. So when Satan tried to offer the kind of imitations of the real thing, he's like, well, I know who I am and I know whose I am. Now, if you're a kid out in the world and you've never heard a father say to you, this is my, son, this is my daughter whom I love. Well, then someone comes along and says, well, this is what a father's love is supposed to look like to you. So, you're a young girl and you need to get with me, or, all these different things. Like you can just see how, that's the enemy's plan to make sure that nail never gets nailed in, that fathers are not honorable. And if they're not honorable, then it's harder for their kids to honor them. And therefore, it's harder for them to honor any father or any authority from that perspective. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. Now, God can solve it and work through it, but don't get it twisted. This is part of the enemy's plan to destroy the family by destroying fathers in the family as a key mechanism. And that's what we see played out in society.
When you were writing that book about the 8 mistakes that those biblical fathers made, was there one specific man that you felt the most connected to?
In terms of my mistakes, well, I had elements of each one of them.
Yeah.
When you look at all the mistakes, I mean, some of the stuff I did, some of the stuff I obviously didn't do. But I think that the probably the first chapter I wrote was the one that I guess had probably the most impact on me, and it was about David and being paralyzed by his past. And I talk about the fact that when David obviously had this enormous, well, I guess the sin with Bathsheba, right?
Right.
And then you have the situation where Amnon, basically rapes his sister Tamar, which then sets this whole cycle of hatred of Absalom, her brother, towards Amnon, which ends up with Absalom eventually trying to take his kingdom. And I thought about that one because obviously David knew his sin with Bathsheba. They lived in a palace, and all these families are like, it's well known probably what happened there. And so now you see Amnon doing exactly what David did, taking a woman that was not his and then not taking responsibility for it, right? And trying to cover it up. And the temptation there is to be basically paralyzed by your past. In other words, because he saw that, and this is just me kind of projecting, but because he saw, how can I speak into Amnon? How can I go to him and confront him with this sin when I did the same thing? Right. And that's what Satan will use. He uses our past to say, how are you going to tell someone not to have an abortion when you did? Right. That kind of a thing. So that was kind of how I kind of worked through that. And then you see the consequences of him not stepping in there and taking the right action in terms of the legacy impact of all that. So I had that kind of context, which I talk about in the book, when I wanted to kind of talk to my sons about saving sex for marriage, because it was sort of like, okay, how am I going to go to them and tell them to save sex for marriage when obviously you're here because I didn't, right? And so that's what the evil one wants to do. He wants to say, listen, who are you to say that? And what I talk about there, and I think it was a valuable lesson, there's a big difference between hypocrisy and growth. And what I mean by that is when you tell someone not to do something that you once did, that's called growth. Right? That's why God gives us these things, and that's why He gives us these examples. I always tell folks, wise men learn from their mistakes, but the wisest learn from the mistakes of others. That's why God left all these bad dad mistakes in the Bible unvarnished. Why? For fathers today to look at those and to learn from them. And so what he even wants to do in that moment is to tell me I shouldn't speak to my kid about, sexual purity and, any of these things because I didn't live that out in my own life. That's ridiculous. God wants to take that and wants me to use that for the next generation in order to do that. So it's probably of the chapters that I wrote. I think it was the first insight that I had of the bad dad mistakes. And I saw that parallel between, what David did and what I was tempted to do, which was kind of not let folks know. So I actually didn't. So I remember the conversation I had with my older son about that. And I was like, we're like, oh my gosh, we're going to tell him this, whatever. And ironically, he didn't see any of that. His question was a real interesting one, was like, did you love me? That was the whole thing. I was like, I wasn't even prepared for that. I was like, what? What did you love me? You had me out of wed. Did you love? We said, well, yes. We stumbled. So yes, of course we loved you. He's like, okay. And he ran off. He was 12 years old. And he ran off. And I'm all like, he's going to say, you're the one, like Nathan, you're the one that, whatever. But he didn't. So I just encourage dads, age appropriately, where if you see your kid doing something that you once did, like, oh, I use drugs, I'm going to tell my kid not to do drugs. I actually knew a guy who told me that. So I use drugs, I'm going to talk to my kids about drugs. How can I do that? I was just like, what are you talking about? You can't, because he said, well, I use drugs and I turned out okay. So my kids will too. No, you're projecting your reality on their life, which again, they have their own life and their own reality. And you're supposed to take that experience that you had and use that to help your children walk in the way that they should. So that's the first one, which was David and being paralyzed by his past and the impact of that.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about CareNet now. You guys call yourself a pro-abundant life ministry. So I wanted to hear from you directly what pro-abundant life means in your own words.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's kind of like not marketing spin or anything like that. It's actually based on John 10:10, where Christ said, I came that you might have life and then have that life abundantly. And so, when I started to think about that verse in the context of the life issue, I was like, what was Jesus talking about? So if you look at that passage in the Greek, in the word life, there's kind of two kinds of life that are sort of illustrated in the biblical narrative to some degree. One is physical life, which is in the Greek is the word bios, B-I-O-S, right? Physical life, and it's like a heartbeat, right? Got physical life. And then the other is Zoe, which is a unique type of spiritual life that only comes from a relationship with God. So when Christ is saying, I came that, you might have life and have it abundantly, what he's basically saying, I came to link your bios to my Zoe, that you might be heartbeats that are heaven bound, right? Bios to my Zoe, that you might be heartbeats that are heaven bound. And so I started to look at the life issue in that way and I said, wait a minute, is that what we're solving for? Bios and Zoe, because you can be an atheist and be pro-life, but you can't be an atheist and be pro-abundant life, right? And so that became the narrative that we should be, as a Christian ministry, we should be what Jesus was. He wasn't pro-life, he was pro-abundant life. How do you know? He said, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. In other words, he's pro-abundant life, not just pro-life. And so that became the operating perspective that we have here. And then there's two ways that you see that lived out in the through ministry. And the first is God's design for family, and the second is God's call to discipleship. So it links those two things together. So if you want to learn more about that, anyone wants to learn more about that, they can get my book called The Alternative to Abortion: Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life, where I walk through all of that. And you can see God's design for family. It's I use the narrative of Mary and Joseph, Mary facing an unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective, and what is Joseph called to do? Be a husband to her and a father to the child growing inside of her, right? So that's the same perspective we try to bring into the work that we do with affiliate pregnancy centers and church partners. God didn't just minister to Mary, right? An angel went to Mary, right? An angel also went to Joseph, and he had a very specific call in his humanity and his role in the birth of Christ, which was to be a husband to her and a father to the child growing inside of her, to provide and to protect those things, which is obviously what we want for a guy who's facing a pregnancy decision. But then the other second pillar is really, the connection of the church, right? So it's really helping that couple that's formed become disciples of Jesus Christ. In other words, connecting them to a local church. So we want folks to go from a pregnancy center to a local church for ongoing support and discipleship. So it's linking those things together. So what's the role of the family? When a woman has a guy who says, I'll be a husband to you and a father to the child growing inside of you, like what happened with me and Yvette, guess what she's more likely to do? Give the child life. 86% of the women that have abortions are unmarried, right? So if you really want to solve for more, life, guess what? You need to solve for more marriage. And that's what you see in the biblical narrative of marriage and Mary and Joseph. And then that family needs to be connected to a local church to be disciples who make disciples who live and love like Jesus. What's the role of a local church? It's to make disciples. So you link those two things together. You have a pro-abundant life perspective, which is different from a pro-life perspective, which is focused on saving the life of the child, which is a good thing, a God-honoring thing. But we're talking about those not yet born and those not yet born again, linking those two things together.
When you look toward the future, where do you see the pro-life movement headed, and how do you think CareNet's going to play a part in that?
I think the thing that's clear to me is that, there's a tremendous need for the sort of the leadership on this issue to shift from the podium to the pulpit. Right now, it's the podium, like it's the political narrative is the lead. That advocacy narrative is the lead, and really the lead on this should be the pulpit, right? Which has an imago Dei perspective. We see a lot of compromising on the political side, 15-week ban, which allows for 96% of abortions, a 20-week ban, which allows for 99% of abortions. These positions are considered pro-life, even though if they're activated, the majority of children in the womb would still die. Like 96% of abortions happen before 15 weeks. The Dobbs decision, which was considered a pro-life law, had a 15-week ban with exceptions for fetal abnormality and I think some issues related to the health of a mother. And that was considered a pro-life law. And 96, like if you didn't do anything, up 96% of the babies would be dead. And that's considered pro-life because that's a political narrative. It's a compromise, which is what politics is good to do. So you look at it from the perspective of the pulpit. Well, it's a model day. Like the circumstances of a child's conception and birth should not determine his humanity and worth. Life begins at conception. You're creating the image of God. Like there's no compromising when you think about it from the pulpit perspective. So if I'm a child in the womb, who would you want leading the movement? If you were a child, who would you want leading the movement? Would you want the pulpit that says, well, no matter your circumstances, fetal abnormality, it doesn't matter. You're worthy of life and protection, or the political narrative that says, well, 15-week ban, 6-week ban, 20-week ban, you
Yeah.
know, uh, I'm thinking I'd rather have the church lead. So to me, that shift so that the church is not just supporting the pro-life movement, but the church is leading the pro-abundant life movement anchored in John 10:10. It changes the narrative and it gives you a word perspective, but it also gives you a deed perspective because the role of the church is to live out the Great Commandment, which is to love your neighbor, of which the child in the womb is a woman's neighbor, to fulfill the Great Commission, right? So you're linking Luke 10:27 to Matthew 28:19. That's the rule. That's Christianity, living out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission. And you have that perspective, you go, gosh, I can't be a pro-choice Christian. Why? It's a violation of the Great Commandment. Why? The child in the womb is my neighbor, is her neighbor. So aborting a child is a violation of the Great Commandment. Can't do it, can't support it. And then what are we supposed to do with those neighbors? Well, that takes you to Matthew 28:19. We're supposed to make disciples of those neighbors. Well, killing one of your kids is not an act of discipleship, right? So if it's led by the podium, that perspective is not there. The Great Commandment and the Great Commission, it's not even part of that narrative at all, but it's the lead of what we're trying to do from a pulpit perspective because we're followers of Christ who wasn't pro-life, he was pro-abundant life. And what did he do in his humanity? He lived out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission. And we have that same call as Christians as well.
So my last question for you is for guys who are listening to this and they want to get connected with you outside of this podcast, where can they go to buy your books and hear more about you and what you do?
Yes. Okay. Well, again, I'm with CareNet and it's care-net.org to learn more about CareNet. I hope you'll go and check us out and support the work that we do. Me personally, you can just put rolandcwarren.com and that'll take you to the website. And if you're looking for my book, you can go on Amazon and I've got 3 books. The Alternative to Abortion, Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life. It's my most recent one. The Bad Dads of the Bible book, 8 Mistakes Every Good Dad Should Avoid. You can get that there as well. And Raising Sons of Promise, a guide for single mothers of boys. And so those are my 3 books that I have. But those are the ways you can find me. My name, as you can see on the screen, is ROLANDC Warren.com. And that's how you can check us out.
All right, Roland. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I really appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk with me.
Thanks a lot, Landry. Take care. Blessings to all of those listening.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for listening to this episode. You can find out more about us by going to our website, noblepursuit.org, or by following us on Instagram at noblepursuitmen. You can find out more information about today's guest by looking in the description below.